Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Azure webinar on leadership mindset. Very happy to have you here with us this morning. So let's get underway then. And I know many of you who have joined us this morning, but some I don't. And my name's Lorraine Flower, and I'm part of a consultancy called Azure. We work in the field of organizational development and leadership development, but we also bring what we hope is a more conscious perspective to our engagement with clients and with the people that we're working with. And by conscious, I mean we hopefully raise levels of awareness and intention in the actions taken by leaders in constructing the best organizational environment that they can. But I'm not going to say too much more about consciousness at this point, because that's going to come up through our session today, and may, for some, feel a little bit challenging. I hope not, but we are certainly going to explore a little bit of that as part of our discussion this morning around leadership mindset. So the first point that I'd like to bring forward is this quote by John Shaw. John Shaw is, he's a philosopher, he's an academic, but he also brings forward some new ideas on the role of leaders. And this is a very profound quote that we really use a lot here at Azure when it comes to trying to think about the essence of leadership. What do we really think leadership is about? And as we look at this quote, we can see that there are a number of things that come forward. The need for leaders to be creative, to be in that space of creativity, and to really understand what creativity means, not just in the artistic sense, but in the use of energy, the fundamental sense of creation, the way we see it happening on our planet. And I'll say a bit more about that in a while. But also to carve out new paths. We know the role of leaders is to forge a way forward, to help create a way that maybe isn't visible to all. Certainly not just to follow the path that everybody else has taken. And so that's one of the ultimate challenges for us as leaders, is how do we get into that space where we are actually in the pioneering arena? And that can feel quite daunting, but actually can be an everyday activity. Again, we'll say a little bit more about that. But also this other point that really comes out in this quote, which is the openness to change, the change of the impact of leadership and of finding those paths, and the impact it has both on the leader themselves, the person creating the path, and how it changes the destination. So that interplay, that creative interplay between leadership, creating a way forward, finding new points of destination, but also recognizing that as we arrive in those places, we also change that experience of the destination as well. So it's a very organic, very permeable process. And this already, for us, opens up a new way of thinking about leadership that moves us on from perhaps a more linear approach, but to one that is much more 360, much more holistic. Now, you, like we, will have come across many different expressions of leadership and definitions of leadership. I think from various research we've done, we are aware of over 300 different definitions in all sorts of different guises, and you'll have heard of terms like hero, transactional, servant, authentic, transformational, and so on. And they're all very powerful and useful frameworks for thinking about leadership. But a key factor in living a truly creative leadership, in really engaging with what John Shaw was inviting us to, is how we see our mindset. In fact, this whole word mindset is in itself a challenge, and I think we know how we use it. We use it in that space of, what is it? What's the framing of our mind? I wonder actually whether it should in fact be mind open or mind flex or mind growth. The very idea of it being set is in itself a limitation. And what we believe is one of the real determinants of leadership, particularly in this world that we're facing and finding ourselves in, which is, in fact, the real world in many ways, this much more organic, much more evolving and emergent world. We need to be able to tap into the use of our mind in a different way, one that is more open, one that accesses more insight, that it actually is growth focused, not just in a business development sense, but in a way that actually connects us with a deeper sense of resource and possibility and potential. So today, this is what we're going to explore, and we're going to get into various dimensions within that may be provocative and may be very familiar to others. And as I say, feel free to contribute to the chat as we go along. So don't wait just for the reflection times. If there's anything that you want to say, I'll do my best to try and weave it in, bring it forward as well as we go. So do make use of that facility. So as I say, we do a lot of work in the leadership development area, and a lot of leadership development has historically been in the more horizontal space, if we can call it that. So it's tended to be development that has been focused on the acquisition of knowledge and skills, and tends to be very much toolkit focused. So it's looking at those behaviors that actually enable us to be more efficient, more effective, to strengthen our leadership toolkit and our behaviors. But it's quite knowledge based, it's quite tangible, very practical in many ways, and a lot of the leadership development that people will have come across over the years is heavily focused in that space. But over recent years, that's been emerging much more into this idea of vertical development, which is much more focused on the transformation of how we think, how we use our mind, what the function of our mind is, and how we consciously and actively use that mind. And so we get into a much more transformational space, thinking about the mind as a much more organic, elastic, and flexible resource. Not really about set, but more about open, as I said. Well, we get into stretching ourselves into more interpretation and framing of situations. So we're able to take on more information, more data, more complexity, and navigate a way through that, and navigate a way through what we see today as rapidly changing and deeply uncertain circumstances. So yes, for sure, it's about using information and data, but it's also about being able to move mentally in a much freer way and access resources that are perhaps a little less tangible at times. It's about taking a systemic view and being able to access the wisdom of the system itself, as well as our own wisdom and intuition. So this vertical development actually is a lot less tangible, but we know it when we see it. So as we start to give ourselves permission to move into that space, we start to be able to address ourselves to much more complex problems and navigating paradox and ambiguity. And as part of this leadership series of webinars that we've been doing over the recent weeks and months, we've already addressed some of the discussion around paradox and polarity and how you navigate that. So by all means, check out our YouTube site, because we've got a number of resources there that really pertain to this space that we're looking at today, but from different perspectives. So this point of horizontal and vertical development is a really key part of how we start to move into a new mindset. The other thing to consider, I think, in all of this is the value and the limitation also of mental models. Now, mental models are, it's in some ways an academic or jargonistic term, but essentially what a mental model is doing is giving us a framework, it's giving us a construct in which to examine a problem. And these are very, very powerful. They help us a lot when it comes to being able to navigate complexity and find ways through the different considerations that we may have. One of the challenges, though, of mental models, and this really is a function of the mind, is that they can help us, they can create stuckness, they can get to a place where we don't challenge our ways of thinking, and they can develop and accentuate a heavily left brain way of working, which is something we see very evident in our organizations. But just to explain further what we might mean by mental models, and these are just a few examples. You'll have come across others or know of others, and some of these may be more familiar. And this really isn't about, you know, a lesson in mental models. It's more about being able to recognize that these mental models can become prisons. So just to pick out a couple here from this list, confirmation bias, for example, is when we look at information in a way that reinforces something that we already believe. And it can limit our probing or raising of new questions if we're not alert and aware to that tendency to see what we want to see in that sense. And we're all guilty of that in a number of ways. The margin of safety is something that many of us will also be familiar with. And this is that practice of leaving some room in case we've made a mistake or a failure. For example, if engineers are building a bridge and the bridge needs to be able to carry a weight, hold a weight of, say, 15,000 pounds, let's say, in net weight. But we set the weight limit, and we'll have seen this when we're driving, we set the weight limit at, say, 14,000 pounds in order to be safe. So we set it at a margin below. And that is creating that margin of safety. And that's common sense, and that makes sense. But it also keeps us in that safe domain in terms of our thinking, and potentially also limits our willingness to take some risks. And I'm not suggesting we put the weight limit at 16,000 when we know that the bridge can't take it. That's not what I'm saying. But it's about the way in which that mindset then starts to become a continual practice, and where we perhaps keep that margin of safety attitude and therefore don't test limits, don't test the boundaries in the way that we could do. So mental models are useful, but they also can start to create tracks in our minds, there's neural pathways, if you will, that actually mean we get stuck and we only use those particular familiar pathways. Now, I think it's also helpful at this point to think about the power of our mind. Some people will be described as having very powerful minds. It's tangible, it's visible. We can almost see the way they think, but also the impact they have as they express their thoughts. Quantum physics has been very helpful in providing more proof, more evidence that actually our thoughts are inherently creative, and that as we think, that is what we create. At the risk of sounding a little religious, and that's not where I'm coming from at all, but the Bible has a phrase in it that, as man thinketh, so he does, or so he is. And the point here is that if we are aware of our thought life, we can be more aware of the effect that that is having in the way that we then engage with the world, and as leaders engage with the challenges, the relationships with people, and the creation of our organizations. So quantum physics, as I say, has brought more proof into this idea that, in my view, reality, that energy follows thought. And some of you may have heard of the double slit experiment, which is where it was proven that the presence of an observer changed the behavior of electrons from a wave state to a particle state. So when these electrons were not being observed, they behaved in a wave state. When they were being observed, they behaved in a particle state. And this notion of the observer effect is really powerful and has been proven in all sorts of humanistic experiments as well. And it's where, as we apply the mind to watching, we affect the outcome. And this is essentially an interplay of energy and thought. Now, I'm not a quantum physicist. I'm not in any way connected with science, really, in not part of my makeup. But the reason for bringing this in is really to remind us that we have a very powerful resource in our mind, and connecting with that in a conscious and aware way enables us to access far more power when it comes to the way in which we engage with some of those intractable challenges and indeed opportunities that we see in our world, in our businesses and our organizations today. Now, we've seen this power of the mind play out in all sorts of ways over the years, and sports people are a particularly strong example of consciously employing the mind in service of their performance. And they do this by setting intentions, by visualizing an outcome, and then replaying that through their mind. So actually observing themselves through the mind in creating an outcome that is the desired outcome that they want. It's a sort of mind over matter deployment, and we see this with golfers, with footballers, rugby players, athletes. All of the top athletes employ some level of visualization. And some of you may recall a time back in history when football team was employing someone who was very engaged in the sort of energetic world, and were derided for it because this person was helping the team to access a different level of consciousness, a different level of understanding. And those two worlds, the tangible and the intangible, don't sit very happily together in our common everyday world, and yet it is a resource that leaders need to be able to start to access if we are to revolutionize the way in which we engage with uncertainty and ambiguity. So leadership requires us to engage our mind at a higher level and to be fully aware of the creative power that we have as a result of that. Why does all of that matter? Well, your thoughts, your beliefs, your values are powerful and they affect outcomes. We talk about charisma in leadership and we talk about a magnetism. That magnetism, yes, some of it is something we're born with, but that's as a result of, in my view, many lifetimes of cultivating this power of the mind. But even if that's not part of your belief system, there is this interplay between the way we hold ourselves in our mindsets, the way that we bring positivity, optimism, creative thought into reality that affects outcomes not only for us, but for other people. And when we see people around the organization who have that X factor, some of that is coming because of the way in which they engage their mind with a higher purpose, with a higher set of intentions and a higher consciousness. And that higher consciousness contains a wisdom that is very powerful and very resourceful and enables us to move into a different space when it comes to our thinking. Alex, thank you. You've introduced this idea of Tiger Woods and this belief that he has in himself, that notwithstanding the challenges that he's faced and of course the mistakes that he's made along the way, that he had a belief of getting back to the top of his performance, the top of his game. So engaging with the power of our mind, both in that determination, resilience sense, but also in the creative sense, is really part of this new leadership mindset. Now I'm going to just pause for a minute and put a couple of questions up that might be useful in engaging with whatever might be going on in your mind. So again, feel free to use the chat. Maybe if you're ready to speak, that's great too. Unmute your microphone and share an opinion. Maybe you disagree with something I've said, or you have some skepticism about what I've shared so far. But a few questions here. So are you aware of your own mental models? How do they play out for you? What do you use, or what are you aware of that anchors your thinking and helps you to process the world? So as you engage with this world, how far and how wide do you seek to stretch your mindset, your way of thinking? What takes you to your edge in that sense? And how do you access the power of your mind? So I'm going to stop just for a moment, and if there are any contributions or questions in that space, do bring them in at this point. Alex, thank you. Yes, Alex has put forward, I believe you get what you look for, and it's your perceptions of a situation which become your realities. This idea of perception and perspective is really key, and it'll come up more as we go into exploring the idea and notion of awareness and consciousness, that we do create our own reality. And that can sound a little bit sort of new agey or woo-woo, I think, woo-woo sometimes, I think. What does that mean? But we do create luck, we do create opportunities, they do come our way, not simply through rational hard work, but by the perspective and the quality of our mind and our thinking, and what we allow to come into that, how broadly we stretch our mind and our thinking. Just another moment in case there's any other contribution before I press on. Okay, so I'm going to take us into the space of creativity a little bit now, and I want to just going to take a moment to share make sure my sound is being heard from the computer. I'm going to play a short video now, very short, and introduce Amy Whitaker, who is an assistant professor at New York University, who works in the field of both business and art. And she brings some interesting thoughts in on creativity. Just before I do that, a couple of other comments coming through on the chat. Karen says that what she does is to meditate on a question and allow the thoughts to arise through that. So actually engaging with a higher mind space and allow that wisdom to come through. And Malcolm, being aware of your mental state and getting into this mindset of learning rather than protection, we can get into a very safe space with mindsets and with mental models. And how do we keep that edge of learning? So let's hear from Amy Whitaker then, and explore some of what she has to say about creativity.
And for me, this idea is part of a definition of art, as Neil said, of inventing point B. There's a 1947 essay that Martin Heidegger wrote. It's very difficult to read. I've assigned it. I've seen people practically cry in class. It's called On the Origin of the Work of Art. And he says that a work of art is something new in the world that changes the world to allow itself to exist. So something new in the world that changes the world to allow itself to exist. So for me, what this means is that if you're making a work of art in any field, in your everyday life, in your organization, in society at large, you're not going from a known point A to a known point B, you're inventing point B. And this is the crux of what's really hard to do, the crux of how creativity is a difficult fit with business structure, which is that in the point A world, in which economic systems prize efficiency, one has to make a decision to invest time and resources, and one does not know if that will have any value until one gets to the point B world that your work is creating.
So I think Amy brings in a number of really key points here for us to think about when we get into this idea of creativity and accessing more a broader mindset. This idea that we're inventing point B. Now, in the business world, as she says, that point of invention, that point of creativity, that stepping into the unknown is a cultural challenge. It's a cultural challenge because we prefer certainty. We prefer being able to know that if we do this and then that, we're going to get an outcome. This idea almost of a sort of a production line in some respects, even though most of what we do in an organizational sense probably doesn't fit that production model anymore today. And yet somehow deep in our DNA, that still sits there. So we have a fear almost of going into that blank canvas of point B. And she said that, you know, anything that we bring in that's new in the world, that art, creativity is bringing in something new into the world that changes the world to allow the world to exist. Now, to me, that's a very profound statement, because it comes back to John Shah's quote that I offered at the beginning, which is that actually creativity is a two-way process. As we create, so we change and allow something new to come into life, into form, into presence. And so creativity is an incredibly powerful expression of our potential, not just as individual human beings, but as collectives in an organizational or team sense, but also in terms of how we modify the world. And if we come back to this idea of leaders, our responsibility is to engage with our world and create a world that is inhabitable and effective on many levels beyond simply money, efficiency, and profitability. So creativity is a risk. It's stepping into an unknown, and it's about bringing something new into the world. And it's also about moving into a space where we introduce to our organizations something that is fundamentally more creative, allowing more expression of that point B and that blank canvas. Ian asks a question at this point: do we think that leaders are typically aware of their own mindset? And are they likely to be open to changing in this new world? It's a key question, because unless we take time to start to examine our mindset, then we become slaves to it. We might hear a new idea and that might shift us slightly. But unless we choose to bring ourselves into that place of learning that Malcolm was referencing earlier, then we will become a prisoner of the things that just happen to take root. So there is an active co-creative process that is needed here. And as we continue in that idea of creativity, we can also introduce this idea of innovation. And innovation is a word we use a lot in organizations, and again, we don't really have a clear sense of it or what we really mean by it. There are different layers of innovation, different here, Skulls offering here of zones of innovation. And in our world today, we are facing levels of disruption, certainly, and the opportunity for some game-changing solutions, but we're not necessarily wired yet to be able to move into that space. We need leaders who are able to find the courage to step into more experimentation, finding new ideas, bringing new innovation to the fore. Now, if we look at that from a product point of view, we can see examples of that in our world today. We have a tendency in most organizations to operate in the safe space of incremental innovation or change. It tends to be that sort of continuous improvement, and nothing wrong with that. That has, that can pay great dividends, as we know from the UK cycling team, and that idea of taking those small steps, making those small changes of incremental performance shift that actually lead ultimately, in the cumulative sense, to gold medals. But if we look at it in the product sense as well, we might argue that Betamax, which many of you may be too young to even remember, was a breakthrough product. It didn't become a game changer in itself because it wasn't able to survive, but it broke through it. It brought something new in. We could argue that Uber and Airbnb, for example, are examples of disruptive change and innovation. Have they quite yet brought about a game changer state? No, I don't think they have. But they did introduce something new. In the game changer space, we might, I'm not a big supporter or fan of Apple, but I can admire and respect the impact they've had. We might argue that Apple has moved into more of a game changer space. They've brought intuitive technology to the fore in a way that, and to the masses in a way that was not there before. So we can see examples perhaps in some aspects of product creation. But when we start to position this in the context of the world and leadership within our current world, and the responsibility of leaders and organizations to engage with our world on a new level, then we have to start to bring in a different scale and a different way of thinking about things. Things like net zero. This has to be a game changer way of thinking. That has to be innovation on a completely different level. BP are having to go through fundamental changes in the way that they see their organization, their role of their organization. And yes, we could get into lots of debates about the degrees of impact, negative impact that an organization like BP has had. But it has woken up to itself, perhaps because it has to, it's been forced to engage in a fundamental shift of its organization to be able to participate in the environmental challenge rather than be creating in the solutions rather than creating problems. But net zero, what about social impact game changer solutions? What about a new form of economy that actually uses everything just as nature does, recycles, circulates, brings the new from the old, and utilizes everything that we have? We as leaders need to be moving in this space. So to access that creative space, we need to move into a new level of consciousness, a new level of awareness. And I bring this word consciousness in, and I'm fully aware that it is a word that doesn't typically play in organizational space. I understand that. It's not a word that we use, certainly not in its highest expression within the organizational space. But bear with me, because I want to just bring this in and give us an opportunity to think about it in relation to this idea of creativity and learning and a more spacious, open, permeable mind. And to be able to access that creative space, we've got to be able to move beyond the concrete mind, that workhorse that is very important and needs to be used, but actually needs to be used as a tool rather than as the governance mechanism itself, if we're to move into the world of the game changer or the point B world. So consciousness we can refer to in many different words, use different words in this. We might hear it referred to as the higher self. We might hear it referred to as higher mind or beingness. We may find that we've accessed it through mindfulness practice or meditation. Consciousness is a space that is a lot less tangible, a lot less easy to get hold of than our more concrete, linear thinking, but it is into that sort of vertical space that I mentioned earlier in the beginning. And as we get into trying to understand a little bit more about consciousness, I offer this framework just as a way of perhaps grounding it a little more. And we could describe consciousness as where we place our attention. So to the extent that I'm only focused on my own needs, that might be my family, it might be, the things that are immediate in my world, that's one level of consciousness, that's one level of attention that we're applying in our life. And some people are unable to move beyond that, partly perhaps for economic reasons, partly for selfishness reasons, that their world, they're geared just in terms of a very self-centered focus. But as we expand in our consciousness, as we grow our attention, we start to embrace more perspectives, coming back to Alex as well, word of perceptions and perspectives. We open up our world of perception and we start to see others' needs, not just in an intellectual sense, but we start to see that as part of something that is within our field of consciousness and something that affects our way of engaging with the world. And we start to perhaps even see that there is a sense of oneness in our world. If we look at what's been going on in these recent months, as we've reduced the amount of traffic and train and flights and airplanes and all of that, as we've removed some of those modes of transport, we've seen an increase in the quality of our natural environment, the quality of the air, the vibrancy of the plant life. We've had a different engagement with nature. There's an interplay between our actions and what goes on in nature, for example. And we know this through the environmental lobbies and our understanding of the ecosystem. But bringing that in as a lived consciousness, that sense of oneness, takes us from the specifics and the individual ways of thinking into more of an allness thinking. And Einstein helps us think about this as well. This is one of his more famous quotes, maybe not what we would always associate with Einstein, but nevertheless one of the more famous ones when it comes to thinking about a different perspective, a perspective that moves us beyond separation and towards inclusion. And in our organizations, we see these attempts to move in that direction through things like the inclusion and diversity agendas, the D&I agendas, the wanting to make sure that we are much more inclusive. The Black Lives Matters is another expression of our attempts as a humanity to move into this recognition of oneness rather than separation and embracing everything. Einstein invites us to do that with all living creatures and nature itself. So consciousness starts to take us into a much broader space. What we experience in consciousness, what we notice as we start to open ourselves to this idea of something higher, something more, something perhaps less tangible but still very powerful in energetic terms, is that we find we are able to use our capabilities and capacities to the fullest, to a much greater extent. We have a more effortless way of functioning. Life flows in an easier way, or at least our perspective on life changes and it feels easier, it feels more flowing. We can find that our focus becomes much less scattered and much more single-pointed when it needs to be. When we want to deploy and use all of our resources, we are actually able to bring that discipline of an undivided focus. But at the same time, in this space of consciousness, we also have a sense of playfulness and a sense of fun and humor that comes in as we start to widen our perspective and take a bigger world view. We might experience a sense of right timing. So we don't force things, we're much more in tune with the two-way energetic flow, and we have a sense of when it's right to bring something forward, an idea, a new perspective into our organization. And we might even see that we experience more frequent good luck and good fortune, not because it's some expressive new age idea, but because we have actually engaged that way of engaging with the mind, the energy, and the potential that sits in a wider perspective. Alex has also given us another comment here a recent conference call, someone made a comment, surely all lives matter. And someone on the call said, don't start with all that lives matter crap. Is it rubbish to think that surely all lives matter? I think even asking that question is a fundamental part of our consciousness. Being able to ask ourselves, do all lives matter? Now, some of us will instinctively say, yes, of course they do, because that's where we go. Others will challenge and start to explore and think about that in a broader sense. And in my world, a spider will come into the house. I don't run with fear, I just leave it, or I remove it and put it outside. Is that an expression of all lives matter? Yeah, for me it is, because it's an expression of the oneness of life and the consciousness that we need to bring into our way of connecting with everything that is around us. So consciousness is not an easy subject to express in a few minutes, and I'm not, not 1 minute saying this is it, done. But I wanted to bring it into this leadership mindset piece, because I think it's the new frontier when it comes to accessing a broader set of resources. So we might ask ourselves, well, how do we get into that? How do we actually access this space? How do we start to cultivate a different perspective and this more vertical space, as well as then using that in the horizontal? Well, the first thing that I've got on our list here is cleaning house, and that's about what we've been talking about, really. Noticing our habits, our ways of doing things, the attitudes, the values, the beliefs that we hold, and checking whether those are in some way distorted. Really asking ourselves some of those harder questions, those deeper questions about how we are relating to others, how are we relating to our world. What are the things that we hold on to very strongly and maybe not very helpfully, that actually limit the way that we are able to engage with our world and our organization and with others. Opening our heart, the response to surely all lives matter, well, that's a heart response that we can bring in there. Why wouldn't all lives matter if we come from the place of love? Again, love in business, love in organizations is not a commonly used phrase or idea, but will need to become much more so as we continue to navigate these times that we find ourselves in. Attuning to the flow, I talked about right timing and rhythm, opening ourselves up and noticing when we are in right timing, when things just seem to go easily. What are we doing differently when that's happening? What's going on for us in that space that allows us to be in flow? What have we removed? What are the barriers and obstacles, mental, physical, emotional, that have allowed us to get into the flow? A river flows. It goes around obstacles. It navigates its pathway in a very graceful way and wears its way around a rock. It doesn't allow it to stop it. It just takes a different flow. This is an attitude, a perspective. Being willing to get into more abstract thinking, not just the concrete, but asking ourselves philosophical questions allows us to get into a greater space of consciousness. Cultivating humor and optimism, really important aspects of leadership, and perhaps not so easy to find, particularly in these times of economic challenge. And really getting into creating and doing that just to experiment, to see what might emerge, rather than always with an absolute purpose in mind. So again, a reflective moment for you to really think about, what does consciousness look like for you? What does that greater consciousness look like for you? And again, if you feel that's something that you want to express an opinion about, then please unmute and share your thoughts with the group, or push back if there's something I've said that just isn't resonating and you've got a different perspective on it. Trudy's reminding us that there's some very powerful research about consciousness, which is about the higher mind and brain integration, which actually enables peak performance. So as we step more into that higher mind space, the quality of our performance is increased. Most of the people who are bringing change into the world at any discernible level, particularly where it's change for the better, are tapping in, even if they're not fully aware of it, they're tapping into a higher mind and brain integration, a higher point of consciousness. What does it look like for you? Just as I leave you with that moment of contemplation, we've got just a couple more things to bring in that where I want to relate this a little bit more now into leadership and organizations, and then draw together some final threads as well that I hope will be useful for you. So we're putting this in the context of leadership, and of course consciousness is a stretch because it's not the place that we normally go to within an organizational space, and it feels in many ways too abstract perhaps for the organizational world. And so we have to bring that into a point of bridging. We have to find a translation of that. In the purist in me would want to bring much more of that consciousness language and practice in, and we see that through things like mindfulness happening, and we've had many of you and others join us in our mindfulness sessions on a weekly basis. But when we look at this in the context of leaders, we have to ask ourselves what's needed from our leaders today. And this is taken from some work by Talbot and Rook on action logics. And it's a way of looking at the different evolution of leadership in not even in a skill sense, but in a very much a consciousness and mindset sense. This idea of a strategist, which is one of the types of leadership that they describe, really helps us to think about the type of leadership that we might need going forward. So don't get hung up on the title of strategist. It's not about only those people who are involved in strategy work. It's about a way of engaging with the role of leadership and with organizational life. And so we see this then come through in things like inquiry-based experimentation, asking questions, experimenting. And Sheila's said, yeah, as someone who's very practical and finds strength in process, creativity feels scary. And this is true for so many of us, that experimentation. And yet, if we take a step-by-step approach, just gently opening ourselves up, asking ourselves some questions, just having a little go at something and experimenting a little, we start to find that we expand our capability and our capacity for being more creative, even those of us who think we aren't necessarily in that space. Tapping into power, not just in an obvious sense of control and authority, but in that energetic power, and using it, really using the fullness of who we are. More conscious people emanate a level of magnetism and power that is an inner power. It's benign but powerful. How do we use that? How do we leverage that by putting some new ideas into the organization? What language are we using? Are we using opening up language? Are we using creative language? Are we using inspirational and language that actually invites people into an experimental space? Are we fostering and enabling difference? Do we find ourselves closing off when somebody thinks differently to us or offers a different point of view? Or do we move toward that? Do we ask questions? Do we engage with their perspective and their worldview? Do we inquire openly? Do we get passionate about things and yet hold an observer and detachment space? Being able to really feel strongly about an idea, a possibility, a concept, and yet not being attached to the outcome is really key when it comes to this new stage of leadership, this new mindset of leadership. We hold the importance of something, and yet we get detached enough to be able to watch it unfold and bring our leverage in at the right time. And fundamentally, we see this expressed in the capabilities of systemic leadership, something that is starting to gain a little bit more currency in organizations, but where we start to see the whole system organization, both the visible and the invisible parts of it, the relationships and the processes. And we start to work out how we can pull the levers that help the organization to function at a higher level of performance. And so if we then apply that to organizations, and we think about those organizations as entities, as expressions of leadership, we then start to see organizations potentially that are still efficient, still have that value of efficiency, but they're doing that in the way that nature intended it, which is not unduly putting effort in, but being effortless, working with the natural creative process, where there is coordination that is a true collaboration. And one of our other webinars was on moving from the impossible to possible, and we explored this in the context of collaboration, which has happened so spontaneously in this time of crisis. But how do we make that something that is an ongoing thing? Well, check out our webinar, you'll hear some more ideas around that. So getting into this coordination that is natural and happens in an effortless way. Really inspired organizations where that creativity is coming through, and we could relate it to that idea of artistic genius, not because of a painting or a piece of music, but because of the ideas that we can bring forward and the solutions that can come forward. A focus on doing well by doing good, really getting into our purpose, and our next webinar is going to focus a lot on a new perspective on purpose. So that's in a couple of weeks' time if you want to come and find out a bit more about that. But really linking our purpose to something that's much more prosperity and social value related. I saw a piece of research the other day that suggested that as many organizations and businesses as we will lose coming out of this particular crisis, the new ones that start up will be very much focused on social value and creating solutions that enhance our society and making a living, and yes, some money, but not probably huge profits, but enough to be able to be doing a meaningful and valuable business proposition. Connection with the natural environment, I've already spoken about, and really coming into flow with that. And again, one of our earlier webinars really looked at the natural environment as a way of building resilience. So look out for that one as well. And being able to change direction very easily. And again, when we are overly process driven, it makes it very hard for us to be spontaneous. So from Alex here, the nature of our business can often stifle creativity. He's in the railway, very compliance driven, of course, which needs to be in place. But we need to bring that alternative, other perspective alongside, and then work out how to marry the two. It's not about getting rid of some of those areas where process is useful and valuable to us, but we need to be able to also add in more of this experimental approach. And this is about a style of leadership which is a much fuller focus on human development, which brings me back to one of the slides I brought in at the beginning, and that's this shift into vertical development. It's an area that hasn't really yet taken hold in organizations. It's a little bit around the edges. Some of the high potential, senior high potential programs are just starting to get into some of this area, but it has to become part of our way of looking at development of organizations and development of our people in organizations, and especially development of our leaders, is moving much more into this vertical development space. And so just as we come to a close here today, I want to wrap up with one final slide. Hopefully what I've been able to bring forward today in some ways is something that helps us to shift our perspective. And even if everything or some of what I've said today hasn't resonated, I'm hoping that what what I've been able to stimulate and what I've been able to bring forward is the importance of shifting our perspective, of taking a different point of view, of really challenging our mindset. And some of this might come into, well, perhaps we supersedes me. What would that be like as a perspective? What if we were to move more into both and thinking instead of either or thinking? Again, this polarity that we can get caught up in. What if there was a place of synthesis where both poles of thinking can be brought to life and into a new expression? Where we spend our time really daring to think about a new future in our organizations. I was speaking with one business leader yesterday, going through some really challenging redundancy considerations and changes to the core business, and his question was, well, how do I actually navigate this without it all sounding really dismal? And my advice, my feeling within that is, let's look at the future, not because it's Pollyanna, but let's help people move into the world we're trying to create. Yes, there is going to be some effects of perhaps not having done that sufficiently well in the past, and in some cases people are going to lose jobs, and that is very sad and very unfortunate. But as leaders, we still have a responsibility to envisage and help people envision a new future where those people can come back into the right jobs going forward. Perhaps a perspective where we see that we're wired to help each other. What could that mean in organizational and business terms? Where we see strategy and tactics dynamically intertwined, not a fixed strategy that then has to be processed out and often not delivered, but where we see a really interdependent and dynamic, big thinking, make a move, test, experiment, come back, shift the thinking, a much more dynamic way of working, more agility that's needed. Where instead of thinking about just things like big data and how can we control and manage and manipulate and get insights, what about big fairness? Ian has reminded us of the paradigm shift we're seeing currently going on with Black Lives Matter. We need to be able to see that we are capable of shifting on a sixpence when the motivation is there, when the impulse is there, and when we're connecting to a higher level of consciousness. And one of the fundamental shifts that we have to make in our attitudes in organizational life and in life generally is that making life overrides making money. Yes, money enables, yes, it facilitates, but it's an energetic resource. It's something that we should be using in the betterment of life, not simply as a means of protecting ourselves and a fear-driven response. Now have a fabulous day, and thank you for being with us.